Okay, good. So, is that working? Sorry? Okay, good. I think more people are arriving, but...
So, is there a lot of genetic stuff going on?
Okay, so, good evening everyone. There may be still a few people trickling in because it's actually a bit difficult to find the place. So, really happy to see, Dunby is there, yeah, so hi. To see everybody turning up at their own pace. So, a few words about this event. Well, it's really a pleasure to finally being able to run it, because initially we were meant to run it on the 1st of March and we had to cancel because of the snow. So it's been a bit of a jinxed thing. So it's unbelievable to manage to be finally all there. I have to first thank a lot of the people who've made this possible. And they are Bill Edwards, who's somewhere upstairs, who's the curator of this wonderful museum. Then the various labs who got involved with my science fiction project and 7 science fiction projects that we have been co-running, and they are the Center for Developmental Neurobiology here at King's, and through Claire Steves, the Twins Research and Genetic Epidemiology, I've got that right? So the Twins UK Research. The King's video team at the back, thanks to who we are going not only to record the event, but to live stream it on YouTube as a big experiment. King's Food, who later on are going to have finish setting up a very nice drinks for us. And finally, for their financial support, I'm going to thank the Cultural Institute at King's, who've given me a bit of a pot of money to organize all this, and the Human Brain Project, in which I am working, for complementary support in this. So, who am I? Because I've been talking and not even said a word about how I end up being there. I'm Christine Aicardi, and I am a Senior Research Fellow in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's here. And I work in the Foresight Lab of the Human Brain Project, which is this huge European flagship project that is both building multi-scale simulations of the brains and doing research on neuromorphic computing, in neurorobotics, in neuroinformatics, in medical informatics, in all sorts of things linked to the brain and the mind. And as Foresight Lab, we are there in this project to try to think about the future impacts of the research that's being done in the project. And in many ways, trying to think about the future at some point got me to work with a science fiction writer, a near future fiction writer, which means somebody who writes about science and technology that is already in development in labs and write fiction about it that is just in the very near future, Stephen Oram. And yes, we've been working in this to try to organize projects and events in this area. And this particular event is the result of a project called grandly Transforming Future Science through Science Fiction. That was a grand title aimed at getting funding from the Cultural Institute, so over-promising like everybody. The idea is that we have involved labs. We have involved actually 2 other science fiction writers besides Stephen. We visited the labs, exchanged with the scientists. The writers have written short stories that we are going to read tonight. And we are going to have 2 panels reacting to the stories. One are scientists who've been involved in the visits. The second panel will be what I have called other perspectives, because they are othering the discussion in many ways, because they are a philosopher of science, an anthropologist of science, and a historian of science. The 2 panels are each going to give perspectives on the stories responses from the writers and then open the floor to you to, we are not that big a group. We can really make it as interactive as we want and as we fancy. Okay, so a bit of housekeeping before I hand over to each of the readings in succession. The event is audio recorded and live streamed, but fixed on us. So we are the only ones who have to give consent. But if you don't want to be heard, don't open your mouth. Don't talk. Okay, that's a very bad way to obtain consent. The Gordon Museum is not open to members of the public, and all forms of photography, filming, and social media are prohibited while in the Gordon Museum, because the remit is that it must not be possible to identify, the museum from its interior. Through that. Although I've said it's the Gordon Museum, so that's too late anyway. That's okay, and so before I embarrass myself any further, so the first story is going to be read by, I've put my short bios. Okay, so our first writer is Geoff Ryman, who has won the Nebula Awards and the Arthur C. Clarke Awards twice for novels The Child Gardens and more recently Air. The British Science Fiction Association Award 3 times and 11 other science fiction and fantasy awards. So it's a very seasoned and brilliant author we've got there. He was the commissioning editor of When It Changed at Coma Press, which is an anthology of commission collaboration with, between scientists and writers. So he's also experienced in doing this kind of scientist-writers collaborations. And he's been working with African writers of science fiction, and is currently publishing a series of interviews on Strange Horizons, 100 African writers of science fiction. Why SFF? Science fiction?
Science fiction and fantasy.
In fantasy, yeah, okay. And he's going to read for us Not Best Pleased.
Okay, thank you.
For you.
Video folk, is this live for you? Is this mic on? Okay, so this story is absolutely inseparable from the person who tells it, which means I'm a Canadian doing a British accent. So I will get the Dick Van Dyke Award for acting, and you're to be very kind and not mention it, all right? I'll doing the best I can. It's called Not Best Pleased. And can you all hear? Not best pleased. Todd used to be an interesting student, full of ideas and very nice to talk to, but sloppy. Typical male. Coffee mug marks on countertops. A vial left out open and the slides not done. Oh, pretty apologies. Oh, I'm sorry, Edwina. I'll put it away now. Please don't, Todd. It's all right. I know where it needs to go. Me, easing it out of his hand. I'm not sure you do. It's been left out next to your sarnies that'll attract other flies. A queasy smile from him that in my foolishness thought might be embarrassment at his poor work. He asked me, what are you going to do with my colonies? I'll keep them warm and feed them and hope they're okay. He looks hesitant. I don't have a long tether. You mean you haven't worked on them yet? You left the vial open, but you didn't make your slides, I checked my watch, because it's lunchtime. Neatly. Nothing to say for himself. Go on, Todd. Finish your lunch, then make your slides, but not with these. He said something very strange. They won't be mine. Todd's working on our famous zombie fruit flies. You've probably heard of them. The newspapers love them. You cut off their heads, but so much of their nervous system is located on the ventral. They continue to live, groom themselves, react to heat for hours, like our politicians. It can take you a second or two to notice they're missing their heads. Couple of politicians. Sometimes healthy males try to mate with them, like our MPs who ask their secretaries to buy them dildos. We phosphoresced particular neurons to see what roles the nerve cells might play in this. We're also trying to breed a new strain of fruit flies who survive longer once they're decapitated. More to study. The plan was to fund our politician-starved research by breeding enough of the new strain to sell to other labs. You can imagine, can't you? Get 2 packs of zombie fruit fly eggs for the price of 1. Just in time for Easter, you too can come back from the dead. Come to think, breeding the new strains to sell was Todd's idea. 2 hours after team meeting, blue sky out of the box thinking, all that kind of nonsense. 2 hours after that, detailed proposal, right on my desk. So, I thought, more fool me. I'd been manipulated. That one's a bit pushy, I thought. But we started to select, not just for consistent, unambiguous results and survival robustness, but for fertility. Started breeding the buggers. What could go wrong? A week goes by after the great Sarnie catastrophe. I think nothing more of it. Todd takes a day off sick. Same day, Yukio tells me I should come and see something. She holds up a vial, a colony. How many of you here are fruit fly fans? You really love fruit flies. Anybody else? Okay, the fans will know it. Just for the lay person now, I'm filling them in, Fruit flies are what you call negatively geostatic. That means they'll always climb upwards, but the individualists, I think of them as the yuppies of the insect world. Now, what these fruit flies had done is they'd ranged themselves in rows from low down all the way to the top, all lined up, and the rows were in spirals, and they were parallel. They looked like cornrowed hair on a supermodel. I held up my multifocal so I could see better. At first glance, you'd think they'd got their heads, but these heads looked lopsided and white. This is one of Todd's colonies, right? Yukio said nout. Face shut as tight as a microwave. She's not one to shop anyone, that girl. Put one of them under the microscope, let's see. Well, we do see, Where it should have a head, it's got something grey, lopsided, swollen. It looks like a mushroom. What on earth? Yukio hesitates. I think it's decapitated, then grew something like a head. Yeah, grew some new behaviours and all. What's it doing putting decapitated flies back in the vials? I'll look again. Headless fly with a mushroom head stuffed full of white stuff. Basically, it's goop held in place by the insect shell. But it still marched information up the side of the vial. That's fungi. That's the fungi they're studying downstairs in Jason's team. Jason's project, 2 floors down in a clean lab. Oh, locked doors, face masks, foot baths, the lot. Don't know how they got the funding. They're studying Entomorphora muscae. That's a fungus that takes over normal fruit fly activity. The infected animal's fine for a week, then starts to behave erratically. The fungus takes over its autonomous nervous functions, so the fly fixes itself to the wall with its proboscis and becomes a fungal colony. When it bursts, it releases spores at 9 meters a second. To trace them, Jason has to film at 54,000 frames a minute. Yukio, please tell me we haven't let any of those out. None of these mushroom-headed flies, because those could destroy our whole program. Yukio's hands are twisting. Their bodies are bigger too. Elevated wings. I get what she means. Those are sexual signals. Males will try to mate with them. Any males who do are likely to be infected. We're a low-tech lab We pride ourselves on it, we have to, with our funding. We separate different populations with painter's brushes. We call it fly pushing. We'll have to burn all our brushes now. Jesus Christ, in a handbasket. We'll have to decontaminate the whole lab. Yukio, please, photograph that sample, photograph the colony, document it, then bin the lot. Bin all the vials, don't even try and keep them. All our bags get frozen first, then incinerated. And I give Todd a call. Todd, I'm sorry to trouble you while you're sick, but at least one of your colonies is badly contaminated. Oh no. Yeah, oh no. With a fungus that Jason's team's been working with. Did you visit the second floor? Did they visit us? Do you know any of Jason's team? Todd? Silence. So I push on. And they've been decapped and left in a breeding vial. So how did that happen, Todd? What's it all about? His breath rattles down the phone. What are you going to do with the colonies? Colonies. Plural. Tell me how they're behaving. Well, that triggers my alarm bells. I don't want any nonsense over discovery this, discovery that. I lie. I tell them the flies just fell over and died. They look like autumn leaves, Todd, all over their yeast feed. Maybe he knows different. He says, really? Not a question. Yeah, really. They're all dead, and getting them contaminated with fungus was a good way to do it. I'm on my way over. Todd, if you're sick, I'd rather you stayed home. Thank you for your concern. I talk it over with the team. We decide to incinerate all our flies, autoclave anything we can, then we'll call in a deep lab clean. Then I go downstairs to reception to intercept Todd. We have contract door staff and they have many other jobs. More cost cutting. Todd comes spinning on through our always open revolving door. Oh, it's 24/7 around here. His skin is beige grey and he's shivering. Hello, Todd. Come to give us your lurgy? Edwina, what have you done to my samples? Whew. His breath stinks. Raw onions, rotten fish, and the interior of my compost bucket. I destroyed them. And the lab's closed so it can be cleaned, so you might as well go home. He sits down. He has to sit down. He crumples up like an old 5-pound note. You're not well, Todd. He throws off my hand. Don't patronize me. Oh, I'm not patronizing you. I'm firing you. Go contaminate someone else's lab. He looks at me through a fog of illness. But you'll publish the results. I see something like thick yogurt in the corners of his mouth. It's beige grey. That's the stink. For some reason, I remember this article I saw in Nature about a cat parasite. It makes male rats very bold and attracted to cat's pee. That gets them eaten by cats and spreads the parasite. People carry it without any sign of illness, except that it makes men bolder. There's a huge correlation between being infected and driving a motorcycle. I have the nastiest thought. Todd, by any chance you wouldn't happen to have a fungal infection?
Thank you. So that was the first one, and this one was inspired by the fruit flies labs. The second reading is going to be by Stephen Oram. Stephen writes science fiction often in collaboration with scientists. Is the lead curator of a near-future fiction series of events at an outfit called Virtual Futures, which happens in London. For London-based people, look it up on the internet because it's a really good series of events. Okay, he's self-professed, used to be a hippie punk, religious squatter, and an anarchist bureaucrat. Currently working at the Ministry of Education, so any complaints about higher education, forward to him. Sorry. He's published in several anthologies, has 2 published novels, Quantum Confessions and Fluence, collection of sci-fi shorts, Eating Robots and Other Stories, part of which results from some collaborations we had with the Bristol Robotics Labs. And he's going to read Zygosity Saves the Day.
Okay, hello. I'm not even going to compete for the Dick Van Dyke Award, I don't think. So this is called Zygosity Saves the Day. Here we go. Will she recognise us? Oh, Isabella, I don't know. I hope she does. I'm not sure how I'll cope if she's in a state again. She's your mother. You'll cope. The 2 women made their way through the snow, carefully avoiding the slush and the ice, and whenever they reached a particularly hazardous spot, Lara grabbed her niece's arm for support. They stopped at the tall iron gates to the grounds of the ancient building, and Isabella smiled as the camera swung around to face them. She nudged her aunt. "Smile," she said. Isabella felt Lara stiffen. "It's okay, Auntie. It's only facial recognition. It's nothing sinister." "I know," said Lara. "I'm not used to these public health facilities. Things are more subtle in my private one." The snow was fresh and crisp, and the crunch underfoot was a welcome distraction from the ordeal ahead. With the wind blowing across the fields and through the trees, causing a loud rustling like a stream running over rocks, they left a trail of footprints behind them as they walked along the track to the old house. A large clump of snow fell from a branch onto the path in front of them, and they both faltered briefly before continuing. Isabella broke the comfortable silence. "Why her? Why did she end up like this?" "Because, just because," said Lara quietly. Isabella was angry and didn't hide it. "I'm sorry, but I don't buy that. You're twins. You're identical. Shrugging your shoulders isn't good enough. Look at you. You're okay. There must be a reason." "It'll happen to me too. Everything she gets, I get, eventually." "It's simply timing then? Is that what you're saying?" "Yes, pretty much." Up ahead, the path was blocked by another set of iron gates with a DNA machine on either side, one for the security bots to check you in and one to check you out. There was no freedom for the old and infirm. After all, as the mantra went, it was bad enough that the public purse had to pay for your care, let alone the cost of having you wandering around creating extra work for the police and reminding the fit and healthy of what they might become. Such insensitivity was discouraged, and the insurance companies provided safe, walled-in communities, if that's what you wanted, so why should the taxpayer pay for them too? Aunt and niece stood huddled together, waiting for the DNA results to confirm their facial identity. 5 minutes might not be long for their self-swabbed buds to be tested, but in the freezing cold, while waiting to do something that you really didn't want to do, it seemed like a lifetime. Once again, Isabella broke the silence. "So you'll end up here too, will you?" "No. I have insurance. There'll be a health solution for me. Platinum if I can retain my current frailty index rating." "But she's your twin. It's not fair." "Twin. How I hate that word. Do you know how old I was before I heard anyone use my name? Twin this, twin that, the twins. Oh, how I remember hearing my mother's friend calling me Lara. Mrs. Pierce, I think her name was. Wonderful, beautiful woman. She understood." The light on the DNA machine turned green, and the old iron gates creaked open. "Come on," said Lara. "Let's go see her." Inside the gates, a narrow channel through the snow had been cleared to the front door. There wasn't quite enough room to walk side by side, so they shuffled along awkwardly, knocking the snow piled up along the edge of the channel as they went. Flaking blue paint revealed the worn wood of the front door. Much like its inhabitants, the building had seen better days, and, much like its inhabitants, it had been left to fall apart when it could have been saved. An all-weather screen attached to the wall outside announced Holistic Hospital Services, its shiny technology making the aging door look even more tired and decrepit. Lara spat on the floor. Holistic? At the age of 70? Too little, too bloody late. Isabella smiled at the screen, and the display changed to Mother, Beatrice Silver, room 343. The door opened, and a bot indicated that they should take the eastern corridor, which was lined with tiny rooms converted from the large rooms of the old house. Halfway along the ground floor corridor was a staircase spiralling down into the cellar, which housed an old-fashioned virtual reality studio. The headgear and bodysuits still hung on a coat rack gathering dust, except for a few that the more adventurous residents used to either escape or stimulate their lives, depending on your viewpoint. A room of fake friends, typical, said Lara and shuddered. The steel-shuttered lift at the end of the corridor stood open, and a 2-foot-tall bot beckoned them to make use of its service. Lara nodded toward it. Shall we? Isabella linked her arm through her aunt's. Why the hell didn't she get the insurance? She asked. Stupid woman didn't think it was the right time for an assessment. When was that? In our late 40s, there was an open invitation from private health companies. The Holistic Health Check, it was called. It tested for every conceivable health problem you might face. If you took it and acted upon it, insurance was available. Keep your cognition was the slogan. Why was that the slogan? Because they found some reliable biomarkers they could use to predict cognitive change in old age, by studying twins of all things. And don't tell me, you took part and she refused? Yes, I took part. They gave me a 25-year health plan. I even had my own personalised medication. That sister of mine scoffed, but I took it seriously, because most of that cognitive change is not pleasant. Isabella put her arm around her auntie's shoulders. True. Look at Mum, she said. They tailored my plan, you know, at the beginning of each year, and each time I tried to get her to copy me. She didn't? No, not at all. Refused. You should have insisted. She wasn't ready to listen. Lara grabbed Isabella's arm tighter as the rickety old lift shuddered to a halt on the 3rd floor. Another bot was waiting for them, and as they stepped out, it glided along the corridor in the direction of room 343. Arm in arm, they followed. The bot opened the door to the room and returned to the lift. Cautiously, they stepped inside and registered with yet another bot authorising entries and exits. It scanned their faces and slid back into the corner. Beatrice, Mum and sister, lay there passively while a room full of medical bots attended to her needs. A white bot with a blue cross on its back was asking her to count down in 2s from 20 to 0 while it clicked loudly. She kept trying and failing, getting distracted and asking over and over again, "Where's Vince? Where's Vince?" Shit, that'll be me someday if I don't die of something else first, said Lara. Me too, said Isabella. Not necessarily. She's my mirror. Only half of you is from her. You can't claim her like that. Zygosity says I can. Isabella sat down on the edge of the bed and sighed loudly. Twins, she said under her breath. Always the trump card. The medical bots finished their work and left the room. Only the guard bot remained. Lara rolled her sister over onto her side. Help me, she said, glancing at the bot. I need to be exactly where she was. They need to think I'm her. She stripped, climbed onto the bed and lay next to her sister. Peas in a pod, she said. Auntie, what are you doing? Help her out of bed. What's going on? Do it. Isabella knelt by the bed and helped her mother stand up. Lara shifted sideways until she was perfectly positioned. There, she said, I'm her. They'll never know. Now what? Asked Isabella. Now, you take her to my insurance facility and they'll treat her properly, give her human contact and treatment based on reliable data. And you? I'll make a remarkable recovery and they'll have to release me. The guard bot scanned their faces and the door opened. Isabella glanced back at her aunt. Laura's tears glistened in the glow of the medical lighting as the door closed shut.
Okay, the third writer has been a casualty of the rescheduling. Pippa Goldshmidt wrote the third story, but I'm going to stand in for her as she's doing literary residency in Heidelberg for 3 months. So Pippa used to be an astronomer, but has now switched to being a full-time fiction writer and enjoys it very much. She writes fiction about science. She's the author of a novel called The Falling Sky and of a short story collection called The Need for Better Regulation of Outer Space. In 2016, she was winner of the Medical Research Council Suffrage Science Award, and one of her poems was chosen to be one of the Scottish Poetry Library's best Scottish poem. And she's written a story called Inside the Locked Cupboard. So after Stephen Story, who was clearly linked to the Twins UK Research Lab, we are back to flies. Inside the locked cupboard. In a laboratory, death is so unremarkable, nobody thinks of it as death at all. An uncounted number of deaths happens each and every day here. Even so, I rely on precision. It's my guiding principle. Each of my staff must carry out the same experiment to show they can achieve the same results. A lab worker must be judged by how universal they are. They must be able to demonstrate that there is nothing special about their results, and they must be able to reproduce those results in the same way some organisms can clone themselves. So my staff take it in turns in the fly room, one by one, to carry out my chosen experiment while I stand outside and watch them through the window. I was hired for this post to replace a man who was secretly addicted to the world's flesh through a net of pixels, who claimed, when caught by that net, that he only looked and never touched. Consequently, everything we do here is open. In this lab, everything will be observed. I have devised a choreography for the human fly pas de deux. Select a fly, position it on the pad, observe it through the microscope, dispose of it in the conical flask. But today, as I watch one of my staff in the fly room, she looks up and stares straight back at me. This uncalled for improvisation, it isn't part of my experiment's design. And I can't see the individual flies drowning in the flask, not from the other side of the window. A CCTV camera installed in the fly room would record more than I can. I'll order one to be installed tomorrow. A laboratory eats money. To keep it going, fists of banknotes must be constantly fed into the equipment, into the fridges, the centrifuges, the fume cupboards, the gene sequencers. It's my responsibility to make sure this happens. Therefore, I write grant applications and I make promises. I give a shape to our future. My office is at the end of the corridor, a long way from the fly room. Nobody comes up there. Even so, the door to my office must always remain open. That is one of the conditions of my appointment. And I agree to this because, of course, I have nothing to hide. Here I sit with my laptop in this almost empty room. All I have are a desk, an upright chair, and a cupboard. No easy chairs or rugs or waste paper basket. I have no need for any of those items. The cupboard is not much use. Its doors are locked and I have no key, so I ask my admin assistant to arrange for its disposal. Open shelves are better anyway. Unfortunately, The largest and most ambitious of my grant applications has been turned down. When I inform the rest of the lab at our weekly meeting, their eyes widen. I remind them that there are plenty of other grants that I am applying for, and they can rely on me to support them. Then I mention the future installation of the CCTV cameras, and their eyes widen again. Time to end the meeting. Afterwards, I go to the fly room and stand and watch through the window. As before, the postdoc working in there looks up from what she's doing with the microscope and looks at me. She doesn't drop her gaze until I walk off. I find this odd because I know why I am watching her, but why is she watching me? What does she see? When I reach my office, the admin assistant tells me the cupboard can't be removed because officially it doesn't exist. There is no record of it in the University Assets Register. And when I sit at my desk, looking over my staff's lab books, I see that each one of my staff is achieving exactly the same result in the experiment. There is no statistical deviation at all. This is not scientifically possible. They must be faking the results. And yet, when I check their observations, I can't see how. Nothing appears altered or erased or rewritten. 10 people work here, and when they sit side by side at our weekly meetings, I can tell them apart, but not the rest of the time, not elsewhere. Later that same day, I am in my office, writing another grant application, when I look up. Just beyond the open door, I glimpse someone standing in the corridor, one of my workers. I can tell this by the white coat, even though I can't see her face. I return to my work. They all depend on me. I am aware of that. The university has insisted that no files must ever be deleted from our computers. Consequently, data storage is beginning to be a problem, and all the code is running slower and slower. It takes me a long time to complete an online form asking for more money. Later that evening, I remove my glasses to rub my eyes, and I notice that the cupboard door has swung open, revealing darkness inside. The cupboard must have done this on its own accord. So I approach it and kneel in front of it. Again, I feel someone's eyes on me, but when I look up, the corridor outside my room looks empty. Inside the cupboard are rows of box files. Each one has a label attached to its spine, but the writing on these labels is too small for it to be legible. The box files are all identical, so I choose one at random and inch it away from its twins. It weighs less than it should do if there were paper inside. Perhaps it's empty, but when I shake it, I can hear something rustle inside like fallen leaves. I place the box file on the edge of my desk and return to my laptop. Every keystroke I make is recorded, even the ones I subsequently delete. There can be no true deletions here. The university has seen to that. A member of my staff is always present, night and day, to tend to the flies. But tonight I can't hear anyone else here. When I finally decide to open the lid of the box file, the building is utterly silent. The lid falls back, and the box reveals its secrets. Inside is not what I was expecting. There are no piles of yellow journal articles nor old exam scripts. Inside the box are corpses, an unaccountable number of dead fly bodies. The box is full of them. They must have been accumulated over many experiments over a long period of time. Why were they not disposed of in the usual manner? I go over to the cupboard, which I estimate holds 20 more box files. And now I see in the corner of the cupboard that there is space. Space for future box files and their planned occupants. I try and shut the door to the cupboard, but it refuses to shut. It insists on hanging open. When I retreat from the cupboard and return to my desk, I accidentally jolt the open box files and it falls off, so that dead bodies cascade down and a great shining heap of them forms on the carpet. And I have no waste paper basket and no way of disposing of them. I want to shut my office door. I want some privacy here, but this is forbidden. I wish I could hide what I have done, but the door must always remain open. That is the rule, and everyone must follow the rules here, especially me. All I can do is use a piece of paper to try and shovel them back into the box. But this is an inefficient process and takes a long time. Some of the corpses have caught in the carpet, and I am forced to pick these up one by one with my hands. An individual dead body weighs nothing. I can hardly feel it on my fingers. And for some reason, that makes it even worse. In the inadequate evening light of the office, I will not be able to see all the remaining bodies, and it is inevitable that a few of them will evade my attempts to hide them away again. Why are the bodies stored here in this room? I feel as if I have exposed a secret, but I can't guess what that secret is. Did my predecessor do this? I had assumed he had only looked at images for getting fired. Consequently, I had pictured him being removed from here quickly and efficiently, just the way you would ordinarily let the subject of your experiment fall into a flask of clear liquid with no thought before moving on to the next one. Or was it the people still working here? My staff, who even now might all be standing outside this office in the dark corridor and watching me as I try and fail to pick up the flies. So, after the second fly story, I'm going to ask the scientists who were involved in the labs that hosted the writers to comment on, from their own perspectives, on various, whatever they want to pick out of the stories. So, where should I start?
I can start.
Cindy?
So I want to make a comment on Pippa's story. I have this sense that there's a sense of separation throughout the whole story. There's a separation in between the PI and the staff, and there's also a separation in between the researchers and their object of study. And this is not my experience. What I experienced is, especially with the object of study, you are in a very paradoxical relationship as a scientist. You do have this metaphorical cupboard of your head count. That is true. You get desensitized to killing. But at the same time, you also get to admire what you are studying more and more, and you find it more and more beautiful. As before working with flies, I did not think much of insects, and now I think they're beautiful, and I see them in a different light. And also, when you take things apart, they also become very beautiful. For example, the nervous system, once you take it apart, it's iridescent, and then the structure of the flight muscles, they're very fluffy. You become attached to these things that before you didn't think you would be attached. And then there's the sense of separation between the PI and the staff. And I saw this more as a metaphor to how we treat the flies as scientists, because the staff sees the PI sees the staff as faceless. The PI says at some point that they do not recognize the faces of the staff in the fly room. And also the fact that this PI just replaced a subsequent PI and will be replaced as well in this turnover of science. I see it as a metaphor to how redundant and replaceable we are, and that this is how we treat flies as well. That's it.
And I didn't introduce Cindy. So Cindy is a finishing PhD student, studied last year in Darren's lab. The fruit fly lab, studying metabolism. Metamorphosis. In the Center for Developmental Neurobiology across the campus. Let's move on to Claire, who's a geriatrician at St. Thomas Hospital, but also a researcher looking at frailty. Between geriatrician and frailty, you are just giving me a hell of a time. Frailty in aging people and relationship between physical frailty and cognitive abilities. And she's involved for her research with the Twins UK cohort. That is a project that's been running now for over a couple of decades, so that's a good way to study people. And so, giving it over to her.
Yeah, thank you. So I work with human subjects, but I just and live people. But I wanted to just reflect on what you said there about insects. That when you study them, you sort of see the wonder of them even more. And I do remember as a medical student, I mean, we're here in this Gordon Museum, but when I first dissected a human body, the actual feeling, the emotion was just the absolute wonder of what is there. It was really transcendental experience. It was a closening with humans in a way, to have that intimacy. So I don't know whether that's the same as what the scientists' experiences. That was just a reflection of that. But about Stephen's story, which was really, it's dystopian for me, it's sort of shocking for me, and I guess, but I think, you say zygosity saves the day, but I think actually maybe compassion saves the day, because it's the compassion of one sister for her other that leads to her solution to that dreadful dystopian sort of scenario. And I was thinking about how that sort of links in with how really the society that's happening in is really not very compassionate, to have developed a system whereby you have to force people, well, you take away their liberty in a way. There's no freedom to choose not to engage in this insurance system, because you will be basically, you won't be looked after. And therefore your human dignity is removed from you, really. So that's why I found that really shocking. And I suppose I was reflecting, reading it earlier, about how the context, the political context of where we work is so important, because we're lucky we work within sort of liberal democracy at the moment, but there are lots of political events shaping around us, Brexit, a whole range of different things. So we could imagine that in not too distant future we might be in a very different political environment which may use our science in a different way. Anyway. So that was one thought. And then going on from that, about how the technology that we might create, who is it available to? Who's it? And is it just available to the people that are willing to use it? Is it available only to people that are rich enough to get it? Is it only available to people who are educated enough to see the benefits of it? So I guess that's... how, if we do get technology like this, how do we ensure as a society that it's used fairly? That's my thoughts.
Hanging questions.
Yeah, can I comment on your comment then? I think this is fascinating, particularly with the data issues that we've had in the last few weeks now.
Yeah.
But I think many scientists and many medics struggle with the idea of how we are going to use this data and what direction we will take it. And I can't see clearly myself at the moment how we're going to decode all of this information that we're going to have, and the time lag that it's going to take to do that, and how we're going to make those decisions in the future. And I think the education side of it, and that way in which some people are going to be able to understand or not understand, it's not just the general populace, but even within the medical profession. I think it's going to be quite a challenge. So, yeah.
Risky business.
So, okay. So, can I'd like to comment on Geoff's piece, and I will not mention Dick Van Dyke at all. I enjoyed it very much, and I think for me, the last part of the piece, where you mention this situation with toxoplasmosis, and how one animal takes over another animal's behaviour or one organism takes over another organism's behaviour is fascinating. This idea of zombie. So I must say that in the lab, we're looking at neurons that we call zombie neurons because they're neurons that normally die. And one of the things that Cinzy's been doing is to try and understand when we look at these neurons and which we've stopped from dying, which would normally die, whether they function. But this whole idea, and in that case she's using some of this technology to remote control the activation of those. So there's this whole series of molecules that were identified from plankton. When you shine light on them, they cause neurons to fire. So I think looking forward, that's a kind of interesting idea about, robotically controlling other beings, other creatures. But I think we see so many different situations where this zombification takes place in nature. So Mother Nature, natural selection, evolution by natural selection is fantastic at co-opting situations and making animals behave in other ways. And the toxoplasmosis is one, but there's one which is quite stunning as well, which is interesting in that we see that there is a fly that basically takes over bees and bee behavior, and that fly has jumped from only affecting bumblebees and wasps in North America to affecting our bee populations, or the European bee populations, and that species. And I think that is really interesting, that you could have these behaviours that we don't know anything about at the moment, or we don't know what that root cause is, what is the causation, and maybe we'll find something hidden, and that this type of story that Edwina and her student encounter there will actually come to pass in the future. So I thoroughly enjoyed that description.
So thank you for these comments. And so we've had this first round of the scientists peeling layers, giving their angles on the stories. I can respond for Pippa because I talked with her a lot over Skype over the past 3 days ago. But if Stephen and Geoff want to just give a quick reaction, and then anyone wants to intervene after that is very free to. So
yeah, shall I go? So I'm glad you found it scary because it was meant to be. I think so. What I found fascinating about visiting your lab, but also talking to the side, I talked to a pair of sisters who were twins on that day and followed them around as well when I was there. So a lot of that was sort of picked up from what they were saying to each other and things like that, which is, for me, sort of brought a lot of it to life, because most of what I saw other than that was data, like huge amounts of data, and we don't know what's causal, what's correlation, and all that sort of thing. So, but the two things I think that really struck home to me, one was the political thing. It's like there are a lot of decisions to make about healthcare in the future, and your point's exactly, who gets it, how do we decide that? Is it because of wealth? Is it because you made the right decisions at some point? What is that? I think, Claire, you talked about maybe encouraging people in their mid-40s to have sort of health checks about the rest of their lives. What happens if at that point in your life you don't want to? And interestingly, the twins that I was talking to, they did echo each other's diseases. One tended to get the same disease slightly later on in life, and they were talking about, I think it was about weight loss actually at this particular point, but they were saying, yeah, I could see that she could do with losing weight, but she wasn't ready to listen. Like, there was no point me saying anything. So just that whole thing about choices people make, should they be punished for that later? I thought it was that political sort of landscape. And I'll stop there. I think that was the sort of nub of what I took from it.
Yeah, I've just My mom got Alzheimer's in the United States of America, and that system is already in operation in America, basically. So the world, as you describe it, was actually an improvement on what can go on in America if you don't have insurance or lots of money. We could sell my mom's flat, which he had held on to. But without it, I don't know what would have happened. I don't know where she would have ended up. So I was saying, AI would take on a lot of the basic care. That's got to be better than the people who stole the rings from my mother's fingers. Anyway, and I also admired your plotting. I love the way in which you established it was face recognition, then a DNA test. But, and at the end, the whole plot works because it's face recognition and DNA, and that was quite ingenious. My story happened because I saw the zombie fruit flies, and a completely different part of my reading, I read about this fungus that actually exists, the Entomorphora muscae, and what it does to fruit flies. I thought, oh my gosh, it's the same kind of thing. And then on the 10th of February, The Guardian, I don't know if you remember, had a whole article on what was going wrong with labs. And, students were suddenly discovering that they weren't working with heat-treated meningitis germs. They were working with live meningitis. And this was happening from 2015 to 2017 at the rate of about once every 2 or 3 weeks. Another lab's safety procedures just completely fell over. So I was interested in a lack of safety procedures, implications for funding. I think it's very interesting that we had 2 stories that were focusing so much on the impact of funding. And then, the story of contamination in lab, and then this implication that maybe something was going on with the humans as well. Why was Todd behaving so peculiarly? So I gave it to Cindy to read. And I thought, well, she's going to say the fruit fly stuff is reasonably good. I'm going to have to improve it. But, this other thing is just crazy. And she said, there's an article in in Nature I want you to look at from 2011. And I didn't tell you half of this stuff with this cat parasite. It affects women male humans one way and females completely different. It makes women cuddle the cats more. It makes men stroppier and more authoritarian, anti-authoritarian, and they tend to drive faster. Slows down the reaction times, they get into more car accidents. And it went on to say that, because there's such a differential between English and German rates of infection, they think that German driving styles have something to do with the cat parasite. So it was quite fun. And that's if you are a scientist and you're asked to collaborate, you may be tempted to say that could never happen. If you're tempted to say that could never happen, you take a very deep breath and try and say, so what were you trying to achieve in the story? And then maybe contribute. But that's even better. That is somebody jumping in to collaborate with you or help you write the story by contributing something that I could just never have found in myself, and actually validated the underlying plot. I mean, there's something desperately gone wrong with Todd's mental processes. He is sick, and it's surely no accident that what he's doing helps spread the fungus. That's what happens with these zombifications, is one way or another they help spread the fungus or give it a second lease of life. So that was all quite fun. It was an amazing project to work on. But I thought everyone is going to write about the zombie fruit flies with no heads. And what on earth can you say except it's really weird. They don't have a head and they're grooming themselves. I think we managed to get a story out of it.
Just one thing I don't want to take all the credit. I think we were discussing with Darren about Toxoplasma and then send it over to you.
Okay.
That's it.
But yeah, there's lots of. It seems to be a recurrent theme of changing behaviours. So I think, but it's fascinating to think that maybe Camus was a victim of toxoplasmosis and that car crash. So. And I think what's kind of cool is that maybe, we don't see that at the moment, but we might find out some of these stories further down the line.
If I had 5,000 words to work with, I would have had my Stropia Edwina gradually work out that, in fact, what we think of as sexual role differences are all down to toxoplasmosis. That's too big an idea to fit into the length.
Yeah.
But that's what, I mean, I kind of want to do that because it's very spooky that it has such a different impact on men and women.
Yeah.
And I'm a nice, feminist guy, and I would have predicted, and under no circumstances would it had a physically differential effect. So, anyway, thank you.
So talking about, for Pippa, about how she got the idea of writing the story she wrote, she told me that actually, yes, there was indeed something very specific, a very specific starting point that happened when she visited the lab with you. And it was but also it was a combination of the dead flies, your lab, your work, and Clement's work with the chick embryos. And it was, the story is about dead flies and this quite nasty discovery of the boxes holding the dead flies. She was, what caught her during the visit of the labs, both labs, was that there are certain areas in the lab where it's all right to have dead animals, you are expecting it, and it's normal, and they are, And you go down the corridor in the same lab, and you are not expecting to find dead animals in this other space. And it's a transition in between, this kind of boundary between where it's acceptable to have dead animals, where it's not acceptable, the transition between the boundaries, and this is really what got her thinking. But for all the plot involving this kind of really dislocation between the high PI and all this, very cold attitude and I think she drew a lot more from, that's what she told me, from her experience with astronomy, which has become this kind of science where there are no more small experiments, but it's all huge experiments involving eventually hundreds of scientists, a huge number of labs, and where there is a lot of bureaucratic taking over, and where the bureaucratic process becomes a part of the science that's being done. Mm-hmm. And she's really brought all this from her experience with physics, but we might see that, based on my experience of the Human Brain Project, this is something that we may see happening also in the biosciences. So that's really what brought her to write about this. And so, any question, comments, please participate. No.
A question for Pippa? Pippa, can I ask you a question? Of course. Christine, can I ask Pippa a question?
Yes, ask Pippa a question.
So why were all the staff staring back at her? That's what spooked me.
Yes,
I thought there's something going on there that I don't get.
Yeah,
really weird.
Pippa is fascinated. One of the things that fascinates Pippa is the power relationships and the power dynamics between, in hierarchies of science, which clearly in those kind of big top-down huge projects is really something which is very important. And for her, she wants to illustrate how those power dynamics can eventually become covertly, subverted. Mm-hmm. And this kind of reversal of the gaze between the younger scientist and the kind of the big PI, and why she doesn't understand it, is this part of this subversion of the hierarchies of science. Okay, and yes.
So the story that you read, Christine, has an interesting solution to the replication crisis. I'm just wondering if the scientists on the panel could comment on how currently it's very difficult for us to replicate and reproduce scientific results. What do you think we should do about it?
Show flies in boxes.
So, I think one of the issues is to have. So one of the things that one could do is to have open source. So we're in this unusual situation because you mentioned this paradigm where within the physics community you have very broad, very open vistas of how data is acquired and how it's published, whereas in biological sciences, particularly my lab, which is quite small, it's very bespoke and it's very, so whether going forward in the future there'll be something much more like Open Lab book, biology, so to contrast the cultures of physics and biology, I think biology is trying to catch up with making things, so having preprint servers now and putting data out there straight away and having full disclosure and full data sets. So quite a lot of the open access journals are doing that. But it's a huge issue because of the way that the whole system has become monetized by journals. So many years ago, librarians, wanted to, had restricted funds, and they wanted to know what's the journal everybody's wanting to read every week, and came up with a fact, with the impact factor as a way of allocating their resources. And this has driven that industry to the point now that there's something like 28,000 different journals. And that is one of the biggest problems that we face, is the way in which publishing and that structure of impact factors in it has permeated and is driving people to overselling their data and doing these things. So I think the only way to move against that is to have all of the data files available for everybody else to look at and compare. And I think that would be, I think the system's trying to do that, but more emphasis would be really good.
I don't see this as very feasible, though, because in my experience, I've never had the situation in which I could not replicate something that someone else did, but this was just my experience. I think the problem is people do not do this, do not replicate things, because they don't have time to invest in this. So even if you put your data out there, I don't know who would actually spend the time to do that.
Well, it's interesting, like listening to you talking about it. I mean, in our sort of science, number one, we often have to reposit the data that we have, and so that people could replicate what we have, what we've done. It becomes a little bit difficult when it comes to GDPR and potential identifiability of, for example, genetic material, which we're going to have to think very carefully about how we deal with that. And but nevertheless, it's generally a standard in most of our science that we do need to reposit the data. And of course, that's difficult for us for funding purposes, because sometimes we want to do more with the data, and we don't really want to deposit our very carefully created data. But the second thing is that a lot of the grants that we write, and I agree, it was really interesting to see the grants and funding being so central, because it really is, is about sort of creating really big consortia of people from all over Europe, all over the world, in fact, and putting together teams and bidding for these huge pots of money from central resources with these big teams who are trying to standardise things so that they can be replicated internally. And almost it's quite difficult to publish any data that isn't got some replication, some in a different group in my world now.
Data was one of the things that intrigued me when I came to visit, and so I may have got this wrong, but what I seem to be hearing was there's, when you're collecting data and looking at it, and it's either not complete or you're not entirely sure what it's showing you, like how do you make the decision that this is now data that is robust enough and we understand it enough to make it public? And is that, or wider, and does that actually mean that the news stories around certain things are sort of slightly ahead of what the data that's released, so actually misinformation's out in the world because people are just guessing about stuff? I know that seemed to be something that was going on with data. Does that resonate?
Yeah, I suppose there is quite a lot of machinating about what's the correct model, what's the best thing. I mean, I tend to try and so when things don't work, when things don't give you the same answer when you do it in a slightly different model, that usually means that it's not right. And so sometimes the robustness does depend on it being sort of standard. Obviously, if you publish something and then it's really not right, that's not good for your reputation and so on. So you would try and only put out something that you've replicated.
Yeah, I'm taking another question. Then I will swap the panels. And and then we'll go on. So next question.
This is
Sorry.
kind of following on from this discussion. So a lot of, at least some of the people who I read and myself, are kind of worried about, how to put this, the extent to which scientists are kind of trained well to make the kinds of decisions you're talking about. So as Stephen Norman just put something like, you're having to decide, which data gets put up and which data goes in the bottom drawer, those sorts of things. And in a lot of sciences, those decisions make a massive difference, at least potentially kind of downstream, to things that really, like social things and people's health. These things really, really matter. When you start thinking about those kinds of sciences, I think that puts a lot of pressure on the role that we tend to think of scientists as having, right? It sort of breaks this idea that scientists just objectively produce the truth and we work out what to do with it downstream. And so I'm kind of wondering whether the panel thinks that these kinds of issues that have come up do put a pressure on the sort of role of the scientist in society, or do you think there are ways of us retaining it?
So it would be great, wouldn't it, if every lab had to publish all their data, regardless of whether they published on it or regardless of whether they made use of it.
This is this idea of an open lab book.
Completely open lab book. Yeah, and in clinical trials, for example, you do have to do that. There's registries of the trial. You have to, you can find out even if it was a negative trial, and that's relevant. It still isn't there in all of observational science. So definitely.
But yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned the twins and obesity earlier. I mean, this is a classic case where, where a particular person with a particular view pushed, American politicians to go in one particular trajectory, and the outcome of that was phenomenal. I mean, unbelievable, depending on how you perceive it. But Ansel Keys' demonization of fat, for example, and the carbohydrate story, then these are but I guess the issue is how do you? So it's like back to this issue of future and future ideas and existential threats. The small at the beginning can become the big at the end. So sensitive dependence on initial condition. And I guess this is the problem, is that you can't easily look into the future because many things can come from one small nudge.
And I think you've sort of articulated what I was trying to say better than I was. But it does feel to me. So when you hear a news story about a particular bit of emerging science or whatever, and you get the headline, and then you listen to the interview, and actually often the scientist is saying, no, you've completely misunderstood what's going on, and that feels like a really difficult tension as at what point do you start warming the public up to something that's being discovered in a way that doesn't sort of run away with itself and become something horrendous, and the role of the scientist or science community in that seems quite important and probably not understood very well by the public in terms of what is science. Sort of.
As a small comment, I'm not capable to go into the whole discussion. But as far as publicity of results, openness of results are concerned, there is a very sad exception, which are clinical trials sponsored by pharmaceutical industries or other type of industries, whose results are not accessible to public. And it is an issue which has people fighting very much, because otherwise there can be a distortion. There is no access to scientists or the data which are at the base of the authorization, for instance, to the market of drugs or devices. So I would be very happy if anything would be so openly accessible, because part of it is not, and it is quite a threatening, I should say, condition. And there is people fighting in UK also for having greater publicity of this, of public access to this sort of data. Golden Acre on one hand, or which is quite, I believe, popular in this country, or David Healy for psychotropic drugs. which has also fought in the past very much for publicity. So I just wanted to add this little bit to your statement before.
So, before we get into more discussions, can I kick the scientist out?
Poor scientist.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Yay!
They will stay in the front because we want them to talk more afterwards. So please stay around and bring in the other perspectives. Not soft science. I mean, this is this is not even
science.
it is a science.
Okay.
It's arts, humanities, and social science. It's not soft science. It's different. Okay, so yeah, I know you've sorted out between yourself who was going to start. So first to comment is going to be Tara Mahfood, who is with me in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, who's recently graduated doctor in anthropology of science, who's working with me in the Foresight Lab of the Human Brain Project, and she's done her PhD project was an ethnography of brain modeling and simulation in one of the labs of the Human Brain Project, more particularly. And so she's going to give her own take on her own angle on what's been read tonight.
Thanks, Christine. We have a very bad habit in anthropology where we read what we write, so forgive me. So as Christine said, I'm an anthropologist of science and technology. And in my own work, what I pay attention to is the everyday practices of scientists in their labs, and then how these are linked to larger political, economic, and social structures. I also pay attention to the assumptions and values that come to be embedded in scientific and technological objects. And there are so many commonalities between anthropology and science fiction. In both, the worlds that we seek to describe, know, or imagine are evoked through stories of people and the things that they make. And in these stories, we try to bring to the fore the ethical and political issues that are at stake in scientific developments. But perhaps more fundamentally, in both science fiction and in anthropology, it's essential to make the worlds that we're so familiar with seem strange. And it's this estrangement which I think forms the basis of our social critique. While the concern of anthropology is squarely placed within the present and sometimes the past, science fiction is largely future-facing. And what's actually fascinating to me about the stories presented today is how looking to the future can tell us much more about the present than it does about these futures that we're imagining. It's not future science and technology which really poses the danger. It's rather the present political, economic, and social structures that are of concern. So, for example, in Stephen Oram's story, it's not the DNA machines or the facial recognition, it's not the robot nurses or the robot guards that are ominous. It's actually the gap between the public and private healthcare that's worrying. What each of these do and do not provide, who gets what treatment, and how. And what's also interesting about your story is that it kind of reverses the typical sci-fi imaginary of the future, that good healthcare is technocentric. In this story, it's actually those with public healthcare who have the robot care, and those with private healthcare who get the human contact. And Stephen's story is also a critique of contemporary narratives that equate kind of human identity and human nature with DNA. And it's this tension, really, I found, between the differences and the similarities between the twins that underpins this holistic health services. But it's also exactly that which tricks the system that are so faithful in the similarity. And then in Pippa's story, which is really a reflection on the really everyday, mundane practices of lab life, the challenges of reproduction, the choreography of the experimental setup, the materiality of the lab, and the hierarchical relationships between the people within it. I think what the story really highlights is so many political and ethical issues that are really relevant to the contemporary sciences. So just as was being discussed before, we have the implications of open science. And she's put CCTV cameras, to monitor experiments, never deleting any computer files. And all of this leads to a science that is too reproducible, to the point that maybe it's no longer even useful. Openness, which is kind of flaunted by the European Commission as being the savior of science, is in this story presented as the obstacle to scientific progress. A second thing that Pippa picks up on is the implications of promissory science. And social scientists have reflected very much on the ethics of often false or hyperbolic promises that scientists make about the social and economic implications of their research. And in Pippa's formulation, it's the experiment itself, the hungry, money-eating lab, that's driving the scientists, and actually not the other way around. Finally, in Geoff's story, you compare zombie fruit flies, to politicians. And these parasitic infections make them bold and brazen and attractive. And I was wondering, in this kind of metaphoric formulation, who does the infected scientist stand for? Is it the market? Is it the state? Or perhaps, as my colleague Gunther Hermanssons pointed out to me, these fruit flies might symbolize ideas that never die, that mate with other ideas, and it's these ideas that kind of develop a life of their own, replicating, reproducing, out of hand and out of scientists' control. But to conclude, in all of these stories, what's strange really is not at all the future, but the world we live in now, the present social, economic, and political conditions that shape these scientific ideas and technological objects. And what these stories all push us to reflect on is the necessity of reshaping this present world, rather than placing our hopes in the emancipatory fiction of a technocentric future.
Thank you. Historian next?
Yes.
Dominic Berry, historian of science, of bioscience, in the long 20th century, because it's up to now, currently taking part in a project at LSE called Narrative Science, so full on with the topic. Hand it over to you.
Yes, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to Christine for the invitation and to all the authors for allowing us to abuse their work in this way. One thing I'd like to throw up for discussion, and I'm not going to discuss it myself, but something later on, is I'd love to hear more about the people on the project, where they see this collaboration as fitting in the history of science and art collaborations, because obviously this kind of thing has been pursued in the past. And I'd particularly like to hear from the scientists what it was they learnt from the collaboration, because that's something that can otherwise get a bit buried. But then for myself, I'm going to restrict my comments to the way in which I got a handle on these stories, because we all got hold of copies of the stories a few weeks ahead of time. So my way to get a handle on all this as an historian and philosopher of science will be through attention to narrative. First, because narrative and narratives are present and shared throughout literature, history, and the sciences. Second, because narrative is something that makes these works of literature more manageable for me, because I am not qualified to discuss them at the level of literature or as science fiction. That's just simply not what my training's been in. And last, I've selected narrative because, as Christine mentioned, I'm currently contributing to a project at the LSE called Narrative Science. So I've come here with something to sell you. And at this point, I'd like to thank my fellow teammates, Mary Morgan, Kim Hayek, Andrew Hopkins, Robert Munya, and Matt Paskins, because the only reason I have something to be able to say about narrative is thanks to all the intensive conversations I've been having with them. So I don't claim full ownership of what I'm about to say. It comes from the work. I'm going to focus on two key features of narrative in science. First, the connections between protagonists and reliability, and then second, the importance of genre. So in our stories, who are the protagonists? So in Stephen's story of Zygosity, we've got the twins Lara and Beatrice. In Pippa's cupboard story, we've got a sort of nameless lab leader. And in Geoff's Best Pleased, we have Edwina and Todd. And from the story, it was kind of hard to tell quite what their relationship was, because there's talk of students, but then also talk of firing, and so there's some kind of power dynamic there where Edwina is meant to be in charge, right? And focusing on their role as protagonists in this way helps us see the way in which protagonists in works of writing are often the way in which reliability is managed in a text. So the most obvious example is Edwina, who is this sort of salt-of-the-earth type, always speaking in colloquialisms, has a sort of common dialect, and that sort of common dialect juxtaposed with those moments where she reveals technical knowledge to you sort of gives it a conspiratorial air. It's kind of like fruit flies are what you call negatively geotactic, right? So it's almost like not a lot of people know that is the kind of sentence that should follow afterwards. So we think of her as being a reliable, knowledgeable person precisely because she sort of gets rid of any sort of aesthete air of intellectualism. She's this sort of a woman of the people. That's why she's a reliable person to listen to. Reliability is also present in the protagonist and the Zygosity story. So the conversation between Lara and her niece it appears to the reader as being entirely unguarded. They're having this conversation between one another. There seems to be everything, anything they want to talk about is available. And that's what makes the actions at the very end of the story all the more surprising, that all the while there's been this plan, at least one of them knows about. But nevertheless, we thought of them as reliable thanks to the openness of the conversation. And in Pippa's cupboard story, we have a protagonist who's deliberately sort of sheds themselves and sort of boils themselves down into something very simple and more like a tool. They don't try and talk in ways that have ceremony or embellishment, which they don't really they don't reflect on their kind of experience inside the lab until the sort of lightning strike moments when the flies fall out of the boxes. So we think of them as reliability in that story through the protagonist, thanks to the way in which they kind of detach themselves from everything and they're constantly relying on protocols and this kind of understanding. That's the way in which we think of them. That's how we see reliability coming from them. Now, once we see reliability being managed in this way through the protagonists, we can also pick up and apply that observation to scientific texts themselves. So in scientific papers, who are the protagonists? Where are they? How have different kinds of protagonists been built into and through different scientific texts? And what kind of cultures of science have been made available thanks to the creation of new protagonists? So that's just one set of things that we might want to talk about later. To end, I'll talk about ways in which genres and narrative and science mattered through these stories. So reading them, they're actually quite hard to sort of define and categorize in terms of genre, but I've had a go. And actually, reading them was a very different experience from hearing them. So I might want to change some of the way in which I've categorized them now, having seen the performances. But nevertheless, reading them, I felt that Stephen's was kind of like a redemptive con or caper story. Pippa's I read as being an existentialist horror mystery. And Geoff's, I felt, was a tale of the unexpected. So again, genre is always something that applies to science writing. So just as I was saying that protagonists are always present in literary texts, they're always present in scientific texts. Genre, I think, is always present in scientific papers. And we can ask what genres there are currently in science writing. And also, what kinds of, recognizing that genre, once we know that there's a genre present, we can maybe start challenging ourselves to change the genre and try and, have a go at writing science with a different kind of view. So I've got an example. So what about pairing someone with a literary background with a scientist to try and give the between the lines version of a paper. So this is where you try and dissect what the authors of the paper think they're doing with each bit of the paper, or at least what they're trying to convince the reader they're doing. So this might end up sounding, at least in my head, this ended up sounding a bit like a horse racing commentary. So it goes something like this. So here we are at the start of the paper, lining up all the recent literature we're desperately trying to get our lab associated with, but then there goes the result. There goes the results section. And now we're just trying to bombard you with reams and reams of data before we lose a few as some of the experiments fail, but then we barely disguise an experimental fix coming up on the inside now before there it is, it's all over, and now you're completely convinced. Now I've given you a silly version for fun, because that's fun. But nevertheless, what might result from setting scientists that kind of challenge with their paper? If they had to sort of expose the more literary form that they're writing in, it might become very revealing. It might become a very exciting and interesting way to sort of share the results of scientific research with much more diverse audiences. That's what I have to say. Thank you.
And finally, Adrian Curry, who's a philosopher of science working at the Center for Existential Risks in Cambridge. So
Just the study of.
Study.
We're not trying to bring them about.
No, yeah. For the study of existential risks. Who knows? Who knows? I'm a conspiracist. So yeah, the study for existential risks. So yes, trying to envision all sorts of potential catastrophes of science as a daily job. So yeah, handing over to you.
So, like Dominic, I want to comment on how different it was to read the papers in the context of thinking about, oh, this thing, about the relationship between science and the future, blah, 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 and then hearing you all read them at a very different perspective. So I hope you forgive me for just running roughshod over these really nice stories. So Tara gave us this really nice argument that what science fiction is about, or at least the stories we heard, is now, not really about the future. And what Dominic told us about was the ways in which genres and various types of expectations we have about fiction or stories shape the way those stories are written. And I want to bring those two things together in a way that I hope will kind of suggest the way in which science fiction is perhaps best, or one way in which it's best able to transform the future. Now, the annoying thing is that it's not going to transform the future in the way that I want it to. And I think the way that we should want it to. So this is kind of a pessimistic provocation, right? So what kind of way do we want science fiction to transform the future? Well, I'm very, very worried about technology. Why am I worried about technology? Well, technology is getting really fast and really powerful. And it's getting really fast and really powerful in a way in which, this has already come up, our institutions and our sort of ways of interacting are really not kind of keeping up, right? A cheap way of putting it is that we're gaining power but not gaining any wisdom, or something like that. And one way in which I'm really worried about this is it's very difficult for us to imagine what these futures might be. It's not like this is the first time this has happened. It's very hard to imagine in a pre-agrarian society what an agricultural society will be like. And I think there's some reason to think that it's very hard for us to imagine now what society will be like in 50 to 100 years. And that's worrying because, there are some ways in which it could be quite bad. And so what we kind of want, one of the things we really want fiction and ideas to be able to do is help us imagine kind of new worlds. But I don't think that that's what the science fiction we've seen today has done. It doesn't mean it's not very useful. So the thing that strikes me is that the things that make these good stories are precisely the things that make them not able to do the thing that I want them to do. Because what makes them good stories is that they're grounded in things we understand with surprising, interesting twists. So I want to just run through the themes I saw through the three stories, because I think each one, in a way, reflects a very, very kind of fundamental part of the way that we currently see the world, right? So I'll start with Geoff Ryman's Not Best Pleased. So this is a kind of capitalistic vision of science, right? Science is driven by a certain entrepreneurialism. It's driven by a need to kind of find money and make a splash, right? And so it has, in virtue of this kind of, Frankensteinian kind of spin, right? The push to try to succeed and to get, am I getting the right one? Yes, I am. And this is reflected in lots of ways, right? So Todd's idea of selling these zombie flies, Edwina's worry about hassling about who gets
the deal for finding the discovery, Jason finding money for this fancy lab. I mean, I think a lot of these are going to be familiar to practicing scientists in a perhaps slightly exaggerated way. Science is, in a lot of contexts, a very kind of capitalistic kind of thing. And this pushes with it this kind of whole bunch of sort of gothic horror tropes, right? Jurassic Park and so on and so forth, that kind of deeply run through. And part of what makes the story click and work is that we can recognize those things. In Pippa Goldshmidt's piece, Inside the Locked Cupboard, which I really, really loved, we've got a kind of extreme version of this modern factory-like idea of the lab. So the PI, the primary investigator, is a foreman, right? They're an accountant, they're someone trying to find money, they're a manager. And the lab techs and the postdocs, for that matter, from the perspective of the PI, are basically invisible in the way that Stephen Shapin kind of suggested, right? And what I really love about the piece is that it has that, and it's, I think, in a way, a really interesting critique of this utopian notion of open science, right? There's this idea that in order to have a lab with no true deletions, you kind of have to have a lab that's kind of almost Orwellian. It's got this kind of scary alienation sort of built into it. And what's really fun about the notion of this sort of cupboard is that it being locked is kind of transgressive in this context, but it being not on the records is even more transgressive. I really like this, like something that if it can't be recorded, then it can't be open, right? And then the kind of climax where it kind of gets opened, I sort of take in a way as a kind of critique of the idea that this is picking up on what I think Zinzi said in her comments, is the idea that we can think about science as being this like perfectly propositional, objective kind of idea. You know, knowledge is always, at least in a part, embodied, right? And sort of a beautiful image of the previously alienated scientists having to like pick up these flies, I thought was really, really beautiful. But notice it's still picking up on ideas that we're familiar with and worried about, right? The ideas of kind of the alienation that comes from living in a kind of sort of corporate managerial structure. Finally, in Oram's Sagacity Saves the Day, we kind of move from Goldschmidt's kind of Kafkian kind of feel to a more sort of Orwellian kind of feel, if that's fair. Here we have this kind of regimented sort of healthcare, right? And it has a sort of unfairness built into it, right? This relatively innocuous decision on the part of the unlucky sister just not to get assessment makes this huge difference kind of downstream. And I think a lot of the work is speaking about not just fear of old age, but fear of kind of alienation, those things that come from old age. And I really loved this idea that the sort of technology is not going to help us with this. This very pessimistic idea that technology is just going to provide us kind of rooms of fake friends to sort of console us, right? Technology is not going to bring us together. It's going to build these walls. One thing that's different, of course, between Oram and Orwell is that Oram's kind of vaguely optimistic, right? There's this notion that Lara's plan might work. And I thought that was kind of interesting because one of the things that's going on with, I take it with Lara, and this is a bit metaphorical, is it's not just that genetic identity enables her to do this stuff, like get through the face thing and then fool the machines with the DNA. It's also kind of the genes that are motivating her, right? Inclusive fitness is a powerful, powerful motivator. And there's kind of a sense here where you've got this extra familial structure, this social structure, that these very, in a way, traditional family drivers are pushing back against, which in a way is a very sort of traditional way for us to think. It's grounded in the kinds of things we know and the kinds of things we understand. And I think that's really important. These are great stories, and the reason that they're great is because they play on the things we already know. We already have to know how it's supposed to go in order for it to be a surprise, right? Why is this a problem? Well, if we want fiction to be able to help us imagine future worlds, then the very structures that make you a good story stop you from doing that. Now, that doesn't mean that fiction isn't really important, because I think as this whole event has demonstrated, what fiction can do is allow us to be reflective on the way we currently are, and not just reflective, but also reflexive, to think about what we're doing now. We don't really know what the downstream effects are going to be from what we're doing now, but I think it's fair to say that us having a sense of what kinds of places it would be good to go to and bad to go to, and we can at least give us some breaks, give us a way of stopping and being like, is this kind of going okay? Because I think one of the real worries we have at the moment is things are moving too fast for us to be able to do that. And so I think ultimately the thing that science fiction can do is not merely tell us about where we currently are, but help us understand and reflect upon the way we currently are, which can hopefully start to guide us perhaps towards some of the nicer outcomes way downstream rather than the very, very bad ones.
Thank you. Can I pass like Pippa 2 seconds? It's to reflect on this kind of promissory, both the promissory science she's bringing into her piece, because the promises of science that you highlighted, and clearly she wanted to inject that, and for her it's clearly associated to you want to get money, you have to make promises and to sort of hijack the future. But what she very smartly, when I said, you ask her in advance, what kind of science fiction is that? And she said, actually, it's what is called lab lit, so it's not really science fiction. And what came out in our discussion, in my discussion with Pippa, is that what is striking about science fiction is that it's understood as automatically being about the future, whereas other types of fiction do not have this expectation. And she said, I write science fiction in the sense that I write fiction about science. It doesn't mean it is about the future, although people expect it to be about the future. And she said it's about this only literary genre where there is this kind of expectation that is going to link the past with the present with the future that is not put on other genre of fictions in the same way. And I thought that was actually very interesting because it meant it's a fiction. It can be a fiction about science with that. And is it because science is systematically promissory that we also expect that fictions about science are systematically about the future? This is something that really started a question that was hanging on me when we neither of us had an answer to that. But that's a question that arises from all the this kind of discussions we had. So yeah. That's fine.
I mean, let me respond to Pippa. So I never really thought that science fiction was about the future. Like, I was a relatively avid science fiction writer when I was young. The reason I was cashing this out in terms of doing this is the project is called Science Fiction Transforming Science's Future. And so, one of the great things about science fiction is because you've moved into a sort of constrained but not really space, that gives you a lot of, ways of playing with, things about ideas and things about the human condition and so on and so forth. And so I think it's kind of interesting. I mean, it'd be interesting if other people think that when you hear science fiction, do you think that science fiction is about what might happen in the future, or is it a literary device for reflecting on the current state? Because I thought it was the latter rather than the former. I'd love to hear what the authors think.
I think there's been a break in the continuity. I think there was I was looking at the Routledge Companion to Science Fiction, dated 2009, and many of the same people who'd be writing it now were writing it then. But there was this enormous, comfortable sense that there was a sense that one of the things science fiction was doing was creating speculations that could be reused in other pieces of fiction, like building blocks, and there's a continuity of a conversation between books. And I think that's, in some way that I can't quite put my finger on, been broken. And that younger readers, if you're going back to some of the older science fiction stories, are finding them very difficult to read and enjoy and identify with. And I think we're in and it may be because we've had a really sharp cultural break with digital culture, that we're kind of adrift. And I'm seeing so many science fiction stories that are actually unambiguously set in the present day, rather than the future, more and more. I do think there's this is a cliche, the singularity, but it is actually what you were talking about. Is it's very difficult to imagine if you're just going to be doing it seriously. The augmented informational, we don't know how the augmentation is going to go. It's very difficult to imagine it. And then you've got new areas of the world like Africa where they haven't done it at all. So even to write a single short story in an African context that's really about a believable African future, there's no tradition to draw on. So the writers are either going all the way back to pre-colonial technologies, and they're drawing on that, and it's very important to them to reconnect with those traditions. Or they're taking 7 years, 8 years to write a novel, because every time someone opens a door, or, if they're going to seriously imagine an African future, no one's done it yet. And I kind of think in a way we're maybe having some, my story was unambiguously set now, and it solved all sorts of problems for me. You know, just, you know, in fact, it was set 4 months ago and it's already out of date.
Sorry, I've already asked lots of questions. So
Sorry.
Okay, so I actually have 2 questions. The first one's really quick, hopefully, and the second one's a little longer. So the first one is talking about this thing that you just mentioned about how the science fiction now seems to have kind of been set adrift from older traditions, and that it's becoming harder and harder to actually imagine the future, kind of along the lines of this sort of imagination idea, and like whether is this a skill that maybe we are losing practice in, because a lot of times now the stories that we interact with we are expected to consume without putting in much effort. So because our primary mediums for storytelling are now movies and video games and VR, it's all about things that have been catered to us. Everything's personalized. Whereas books, it used to be you read it, but then you have to imagine all the details, all the flourishes, all the the grandioseness. It's not just given to you. You have to work for it. And so maybe part of it is that we are not in the practice of using our imagination in the same way as we were before. I think I lost track of where my question was. So maybe
I think so. If you look at the sort of really popular sci-fi movies, the thing that always frustrates me about them is they're just cowboys and Indians on a different planet. They're not actually taking things that much further. I mean, I don't know if you saw Arrival, which I think was like very, very unusual in that it really did do something different. So I do wonder whether there's a market that is trying to replicate the cowboys and Indians type of stuff. It's what becomes visible, what actually gets published, and all that sort of thing. But I'd also, you're probably right as well around what's easy to consume. Although I imagine, so I don't play video games personally, but I imagine there's quite a lot of imagination has to go into playing some of those in terms of understanding the world you're in and stuff. So
in terms of understanding and in terms of generating your own direction, sorry, yes, I agree. But in terms of imagining, so the visualization of details and of relationships and of content, if we're so visual biologically, if it's being all shown to you, then you don't have to imagine, right? But if it's a book or a radio play or somebody telling you a story and you're hearing it, because we're so visual biologically, I think anytime we get information, we try to spatialize it, we try to turn it into something that our visual system can understand. And that practice maybe it's not, maybe it is like a skill that does have to be fostered over and over and over again within each individual's lifetime.
Just briefly before we move on, as someone who doesn't think visually, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, Samuel Delaney, it's interesting in the now famous definition of genre, said genre isn't a series of contents, it's reading protocols. And I think one of the breaks that's happened with science fiction is the nightmare. I remember somebody saying this to me 10 years ago is enough disruption to the reading protocol and people won't be able to read the stories in the same way. And I remember the process at 10 of reading science fiction stories and just not getting them. And then, I gradually had to learn that, CAD-lit was a kind of battery and that would plug into something else. And I began to learn how to read them. And I think if, in the same way that actually, reading or playing a video game is immensely skilled, and you have to learn how to do it. If there's been a break in the continuity, it may be a break in, a different kind of reading protocol. It's a nightmare I have. I can't put my finger on it, but I think there might be something in that. There's a fascinating website called Young People Read Old SF, and it's a series of young people reading all these stories and reacting to them, and they're of no interest to them.
In defense of young people, I just want to point out that Asimov and Ursula K. Le Guin, those folks still have sway on younger generations?
Well, it's read them on Isaac Asimov. Read them on reading the Foundation trilogy, and it's really interesting for someone like me to see those fictions through their eyes. And there has been, huge cultural change, and it's great fun to see.
Leonie? Because you've been trying to say something. Okay.
No, I was wondering about what you said, because I'm very interested in that idea of imagination being some kind of skill that you have to train or develop. But is it really, because when you started making your point, I thought, well, I disagree, because if you read like a 19th century novel, you're like overloaded with details. So it's not as if you were asked to imagine all those kinds of things, but then you continued saying that it's very different because it's not visual. So you seem to imply that when you read words, then there's some kind of process of translation, and that is what feeds or develops like the skills of imagination. But do you think that relies like so much on the thing being either visual or textual, or are there some other?
So I agree that some people feel more comfortable thinking with different sensory modalities, but I just mean evolutionarily speaking, our brain evolved based on this being our primary sensory modality. So like that surely has an impact on the way we think and what cognitive skills require constant maintenance.
Well, of course, people have looked at the history of important developments in the way in which things are shared, images are shared. If you look at the origins, if you look at people who worked on the history of photography, they make some very important claims about the creation of that capacity did to society and to the ways in which work is done. And the only spin I'd like to put on all this conversation is, of course, everything that we're saying doesn't apply only to fictional writing. These are interesting questions for one to hold in one's head when they're thinking about the development of science also.
I wanted to reflect something that Stephen said. You just said when we were talking about what Indian science fiction films and them being sort of cowboys and Indians, you said, well, maybe that's what gets published or what gets through. And in a sense, you're talking in the literary world about the same filter that we were kind of talking about in the scientific world, about what data gets through. Who's the filter? Is it the scientist? Maybe there's a scientist and there's a publisher, then there's the peer reviews, and the filters in the literary world might be similar to, there might be reflections between the filters, and could there be such a thing as open literature?
There is, I think. So Wattpad is probably the most famous of those, isn't it, where that's open sort of stuff. I guess the way I do it, which is I don't go through a publisher. Well, I do. It's a sort of hybrid situation, but there is. If you look at bookshops, I think bookshops is probably the place to look. In terms of what gets into bookshops, it tends to be from big publishing houses, and publishing houses have gatekeepers because they have a brand to keep up and they have a particular sort of thing that they know sells. So I think it's shifting quite a lot. Feels to me like it sort of has, I'm going to show my age here now, but as punk was in the late 70s with music, so some of that is now possible and happening around some of the writing with being able to publish yourself. Amazon, for all it's bad, is also a very good way of distribution for anybody. So I don't know if that... but
how does that work in science? Because see, you work as an individual. I work as part of a department and part of a university, which requires certain things of me in terms of what I can publish. So if I went open source with my science, I can go open access. But, well, that's the thing. So, I mean, I guess the constraints placed upon me are different from the constraints placed upon me.
Where do non-disclosure agreements come in? Because you mentioned the gentleman there, I don't have a name for you, but you're talking about, a lot of the science is actually closed because it's commercial science, it's non-disclosure agreements. It's a very different situation altogether there.
Well, you can have non-disclosure agreements between, they don't have to be commercial to have non-disclosure.
I think it's a really, really interesting question. So I'm really kind of worried and motivated by the various ways in which the sort of social structure of science leads it to be very, very conservative and risk averse. There are lots and lots of features of science that mean that, particularly when you're an early career scientist, if you're an early career scientist, you don't have too many options, and you're going to make very conservative decisions about what you're going to research because you have to. If you don't, you're basically out of the game. And so one thing that I think is really important at the moment is for us, part of the things we should be imagining are different types of scientific structures. I think people are starting to do this, but it's never occurred to me that we might think about various ways in which fiction is doing this, because of course fiction has, I think, to an extent in a much more limited way, but because, for exactly the point you just said, right, one difference, both fiction writing and science are high risk, because it's quite hard to get published. It's really hard to get your fiction book published. That's really hard. But you don't need a team. You don't need the same kinds of structures. And so they're quite different. But it'd be interesting to think about the ways in which people are pushing kind of alternative kinds of things. And I take it that one of the things that weirdly seems to work, allow me to speak of something about which I know very little in academics. So I take it that one of the things that seems to be important in the fiction world is creating kind of incentives to try and encourage people to have awards for instance, science fiction, which is speaking to, I think we mentioned, like African contexts, right? There are these kind of very blunt, top-downy ways of trying to do this. And I suspect that in science, actually, there might be some blunt, top-downy ways of trying to encourage kind of people to be less conservative. It's about creating structures that are going to support people to do that kind of work. Very hard to actually imagine how to do that, but I think that it's something we should be doing.
African science fiction wouldn't have happened without self-publication, blogs, online. It simply wouldn't have happened at all. There was no way they could get to GateTED. There was no traditional publishing. So.
Darren.
Yeah, can we go back to your narratives in science? Because I think this is really interesting, and as we touched on this idea of like an open source science with an open lab book, and what would that future look like where anybody can access that? Would it be that then you would have publications where you would essentially synthesize the data? But as far as narratives and the way that science is communicated in scientific publications now, I'm really interested in how you think that could be, changed. And you just mentioned something there. But I think this is really, it's going to be a time when we could embrace this.
Sure. So I'm very interested in the kinds of things that you're pointing to there in terms of the science communication and the ways in which scientific research ends up being represented in lots of different ways. But I'm also equally, and probably for the purpose of the project, much more interested in the ways in which narratives are present inside some sciences. So good examples to point to, and Adrian's contributed to a special issue on this topic that you can, like anyone is interested, I can send them the link. But there are certain kinds of sciences that are just inherently they have a narrative form. So I'm interested in paying attention to that and seeing what it tells us about those sciences in contrast to other kinds of sciences, or rather the times when narrative comes in and out of the various things of what you're doing. So one thing that I looked at in our previous project was to do with the creation of workflows in certain laboratories. So some laboratories, just by the nature of the kind of work they're doing, they're asking iterations of virtually the same question over and over and over again. And so they establish something like a workflow.
So is that science or technology?
Well, I mean, the question of what constitutes science or technology is a question that has its own history, a long and fraught history with lots of different interpretations of what counts as science, what counts as technology, whether or not you should just refer to technoscience and give up on the kinds of the distinction entirely. One of the things I'm always worried about when it comes to art-science collaborations is that, and it's actually something that I was alerted to through the work of Charlotte Slay down at Kent. So she's an historian of, one of the things she's a historian of is science fiction. And she's, as part of that work, she's looked at the history of art-science collaborations. So one of the things she kind of flags up is that sometimes an art-science collaboration can end up reducing science to just the technology. Like, all you do is end up talking about the technical features of things, what happens in the world, like the outputs of the lab, all that kind of stuff, rather than trying to appreciate what's the epistemological question at hand. What is the research space like? Now, I don't know if there was any tension for the authors when they started out. Like, what's the nature of the thing I'm going to try and, what am I going to take to be my phenomena? Am I going to take to be my phenomena what the lab is doing with tools and stuff, that kind of thing, or the research program itself? I don't know if that tension existed. But that's one of the things I'd want to try and pay more attention to.
One of the questions, so I've done a few of these things, and one of the questions that I ask is, how do you see your work contributing to the future? Which gets a whole variety of answers from people. Some people have thought about that. Some people are like, that's not what I'm doing. But just sort of in that space, it's like, I'd really like to know how you imagine the world changing as a result of what you're doing.
I think that can often differ greatly between individuals. I mean, whether or not they have a prepared answer can differ greatly between fields and also between personalities. So often, as part of the postgraduate training, a scientist will be encouraged to have their elevator pitch, where they explain what they were doing, that kind of thing. And so the first part of that will be hunger, or health, or security, or some big thing, right, that they then fit themselves into. And that's how you start this narrative process chugging along. And its behaviour then gets replicated later on in their careers. So it's definitely replicated as part of a research grant process. But again, I want to say that that's not it seems to be very obvious why funding is something that came out in all the papers. It's because funding is an issue that everyone who works in any kind of industry where you're relying on yourself to produce some kind of result, funding is essential to what you're thinking about all the time. And it's kind of, I actually think of it sort of in these papers as being, in these stories, as being a slightly unfortunate feature, because it ends up making it relies on this juxtaposition between that pure thing called science and this grubby sort of thing called money, where in actual fact they've been together for as long as there's been science. So whether or not it should feature overly heavily in these particular kinds of stories as opposed to any other kind of story, I think that's kind of worth thinking about. I'll stop now.
Could I speak to that briefly, or do you want to go?
And what I'm saying, in 3 minutes, I'm going to throw everybody in there, because you will be able to go on talking while drinking and eating, and because in any case we'll be thrown out of the museum around 8 o'clock, because then the curator is going to want to close down. So
May I tell
quickly,
a joke? May I tell a joke before the last question? So I ran a workshop with paleontologists and philosophers, and I asked, why is it that paleontology is so successful? What I meant by that was something like, how is it that we're able to find out so much about the past given the evidence we have, or something like that? And one of the paleontologists immediately said, oh, that's easy, we're really good at getting money. It was really interesting that their conception of what it was to be successful was to have a grant, as opposed to, as a high-minded philosopher, it was to find the truth or have lots of evidence or something like that.
Well, this money thing, I agree with you. Having been trained in history of science, the money thing has been there forever. Looking for patrons, you read Galileo life. I mean, clearly he was looking for money all the time. But one of the things that Pippa pointed out to me, because she used to be an astronomer, and she started quite a while ago already, was how she's seen this change happening, where not only bureaucracy is taking over and becoming part of the scientific process, whereas it was not really a given thing before, but also there are those kind of trends, like when people write about their achievements more and more, you find as a sign of success, they mention the amounts of the grants they have got. And she said, it was not the case when I started in science. And this is something which is a new trend. So it's not only, the money is always, the money driver has always been there, necessity to get money, but it's become this measure of success.
Well,
and this is maybe...
metrics, and I think in Pippa's story, actually, the PI is replaced. And the PI will be replaced by a younger PI who's able to get money because they've come from a postdoc lab where they've had lots of resource. So this is the reality of the industrialization, I think, and metrics. So
it's worth pointing out that all the labs that were visited were university-based labs. So a lot of the kinds of pressure, the kinds of social and political change occurring across university campuses is part of what these stories are about, particularly when it comes to the funding story.
Last one, and then we go drinking.
So there's been a lot of talk about how what a profound impact on society science has, and the sort of changing collection of day-to-day activities that we are calling scientific activity. I was wondering if the panel could maybe share their thoughts on, so given how much trust and freedom and resources are given to scientists, what do you feel are the responsibilities? So you mentioned earlier there's a lot of power but not necessarily wisdom. And another sort of cliche phrase about power is with great power comes great responsibility. So given that scientists are given so much power, could you maybe talk about the great responsibilities that come with being a scientist?
I don't think scientists themselves have much power. I mean, one of the themes we've been talking about is that, so what I meant was that our technology is becoming very, very powerful. In a weird way, maybe our science is getting less powerful. If you think science is in the business of trying to explain things, we're less able to explain how our technology works. But generally speaking, scientists are incredibly constrained by the funding structures, by the way they're trained, by all of these things. And so maybe your question really is, so do you want to rephrase the question?
Well, I'm just referring to when the general public is polled on who they trust the most, when somebody stands up and says, I am a blank, and this is what I think. Scientists get the most trust from the general public. So I'm saying, given the amount of trust that we have, what is our responsibility?
Do we still have trust? Do you still have trust?
I think lots of people do. Lots of people.
Okay. But actually, one thing to note is probably that, I mean, for the European Commission, for example, when they talk about responsible research and innovation, most of the interventions that they fund is actually to look at how scientists can be more responsible for the decisions that they're making. But one thing that I found, I don't know about you, is that actually scientists feel very powerless to make any changes. And I mean, they feel that they're kind of victims of these much larger structures that they have no control over, that really shape everything that they're doing. And there's pressures to collaborate with industry and with other kinds of partners that, again, they just feel that they have no power to influence.
Well, we also don't really, I don't really hear a lot of conversations between my colleagues about what our responsibilities are to society.
So, I'll very quickly say a political philosophy thing. So a political philosophy thing, in order to have an obligation, you have to be in a position to do something about it. And so maybe the kind of answer here might be something like, until individual scientists or groups of scientists are put into a position where they're actually able to take on those responsibilities. It looks like the structures have to change.
What are you waiting for?
So I wouldn't turn to political philosophy for this kind of decision. As Tara mentioned, the idea of responsibility and science is going hand in hand is something that's at the moment quite a useful way for some people to win money every now and then. So aspects of responsibility are being internally eaten out from within inside. For me, I'd always want to question why the person is coming to me worried about responsibility. So by and large, the person who's doing that is doing so because they feel they're being watched, rather like the scientist in Pippa's story, and they want to make sure that they've got their back covered to some degree or another. So I'm very familiar with the history of genetics and genetic modification. So a lot of the scientists that I talk to are people who work pursuing genetic modification. The quicker that they can learn to realize that there is not one thing out there called the public, there are lots of different kinds of publics, and that actually they might have to change their notion of what responsibility is if provoked to start thinking about it. Responsibility does not just mean some kind of general nod towards the ethical realm, and that they go, yes, the ethical realm, and then, so I've been responsible, right? No, maybe you'll have to do some work and think about politics, think about the way the power works, think about the way that your lab sits inside the rest of the university or inside the International Network of Science, and that will be the way to deal with responsibility, rather than sort of performing anxiety.
Right. So that all those things that you just listed, thinking about where do I sit amongst this greater, system of like human endeavor that's going on, and how does what my lab doing fit into, what are perhaps maybe this is too grandiose, but the goals that science has for themselves in order to, I don't know, is it partly is it to help society? Is it to, like,
so
these kinds of thought exercises, I feel like I had to really go out of my way to experience as a scientist, and it wasn't something that was like, so for instance, in neuroscience, everyone's expected to like learn certain procedures and to understand certain basic facts about neurons, but we don't have the same expectation for, you are expected to spend some time reflecting on.
So I have a quick self-serving answer, which I think reflects nicely also on this meeting. So to some extent, this meeting is rather like having a mini tutorial in history and philosophy of science and science technology studies. These are well-established disciplines that have departments everywhere that you work, and they have people like Christine that you can go and talk to and take lessons from. So the greater extent to which undergraduate courses in the sciences could incorporate more modules and cross-disciplinarity at that level, the more likely people are going to, like such as yourself, going to have the opportunity to reflect on their science. And it's not just, and they will learn at the same time that the science, that thing that they thought was science, is not what they believed.
And this is actually a big
Sorry, and I would say, sorry to interrupt, I would say that the other thing as well is that the creativity that we've seen from the writing and the creativity that takes place in science, these are two very similar things. So it's quite, you know, I think they're complementary in that respect as well. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that one of the big things that's being discussed is also the differences between, say, UK and US education. In the US, you get to choose so many more subjects that you take as part of your degree, and in the UK, it's kind of very structured. But finding ways of incorporating this kind of education within people's scientific degrees would be good.
So that's a good way to, and we move there, and we can go on talking between each other because around the round table and yeah.